I now want to turn to the interest rates. Now, I've talked about how the fall in land prices generated a sharp increase in risk perceptions in financial markets and how that in turn led to a financial crisis. I now want to talk about what I see as the second key effect of the fall in land prices. This fall reduced the net worth of many households and firms. They responded by foregoing consumption and investment projects. The fall in household demand for consumption and firm demand, household demand for consumption and firm demand for investment led in turn to a fall in output and employment and put downward pressure on the price level. So the FOMC reacted. It reacted by lowering its target interest rate from 5.25% in August 2007 to a range of 0 to 25 basis points in December 2008. Since inflation expectations remain stable and the real interest rate is the difference between the target rate and the expected inflation, the FOMC's action has the effect of lowering the real interest rate facing households. Households respond. They respond by saving less and demanding more consumption. Similarly, firms undertake more investment projects. And in this way, the FOMC can partially offset the impact on the economy of the loss of net worth. Now, lowering rates can lead to undesirable inflationary pressures within the economy. But the recent path of inflation shows little evidence of such pressures. From the fourth quarter of 2006 through the fourth quarter of 2007, so over the year 2007, core PCE inflation was 2.4%. Now, as I mentioned earlier, core inflation during 2010 was considerably lower at 0.8%. So we've fallen from 2.4% right before the recession down to 0.8% today. The fall in headline PCE inflation, which includes food and energy, has actually been even more dramatic, from 3.5% down to 1.2%. Indeed, given the fall in inflation and the high rate of unemployment, the FOMC would probably have liked to respond by cutting its target interest rate still further. The problem is that the target interest rate is essentially at 0, and you can't go negative with that. A lot of people have talked about how to do it, but you can't do it. Instead, from December 2008 through March 2010, and again beginning in November 2010, the FOMC engaged in large-scale purchases of long-term treasuries. The goal of these transactions is to lower longer-term real interest rates, and again to offset the impact on the economy of the net worth shock. So the fall in land prices triggered an increase in risk perceptions and a decrease in household net worth. The increase in risk led to a major financial crisis, and that crisis has been cured, thanks, I think, in no little part to actions by the Federal Reserve. The decrease in net worth led to a major recession and ongoing slow recovery, and the Federal Reserve's reduction in interest rates has lessened the impact of the net worth shock. But now I turn to the hypothetical posed in the last third of It's a Wonderful Life. So this section is titled George Meet Clarence. So suppose that there were no Fed. What would have happened to the U.S. economy in the past 3 years? So you want to think about Clarence taking us along to show us what would have happened. So the Federal Reserve's key power is that it has the ability to adjust the size of what's called the monetary base. Now, the monetary base has two components. The first is currency, the bills and the coins that we use for transactions. The second component consists of what's called bank reserves. Now, these are essentially the deposits that various banks have with the Fed, they hold with the Fed. And what the Fed has been able to do is expand the monetary base by more than 100% from September 2008 through the end of 2010. So when I say I'm going to imagine the Fed does not exist, I'm going to imagine an America in which the monetary base is essentially fixed in size. So suppose the monetary base had been fixed in the past 3 years at its December 2007 level. What would have happened? Well, one consequence is immediate. The Fed funded its various lending programs by creating large amounts of bank reserves. If the monetary base were fixed in size, the Fed could not have created those lending initiatives. And as a result, many more solvent financial institutions would have failed during the financial crisis. There is a more subtle effect, too. the limitation on the size of the monetary base would have made currency and bank reserves scarcer after 2007. I mean, there's not as much of those stuff, so they have to be scarcer. Their scarcity would have made these monetary assets more valuable in a couple of different ways. First, they would have been more valuable relative to other financial assets. That means the other bond prices, for example, would have been lower and their yields higher. Second, currency and bank reserves would have been more valuable relative to consumer goods. Hence, expected inflation and realized inflation would have been lower over the past 3 years. So higher bond yields and lower expected inflation work in the same direction. Households and firms would have faced higher real interest rates. Their demand for consumption and investment would have been lower. So if the Federal Reserve could not have adjusted the monetary base upward, real GDP would have fallen by even more than 4%, and unemployment would have been well above 10%. As with any counterfactual, these ruminations are necessarily conjectural, but there are data to support them. In the early years of the Great Depression, the United States was on the gold standard, and so the Fed could not easily adjust the quantity of bank reserves. And as a result, the Fed did not engage in broad-based lending during the 29 to 33 period, nor did it cut interest rates aggressively. By 1933, hosts of financial institutions had failed. Real GDP had fallen by over 25%. Unemployment was 25%, and the nation had experienced annual double-digit rates of deflation. The Fed's passiveness in 1929 to 33 was associated with an economic catastrophe. Now, many scholars, including Milton Friedman and Fed Chairman Ben Bernanke, have argued that much of this association should, in fact, be viewed as causal. Now, my version of It's a Wonderful Life may strike some of you as incomplete because it starts in 2007. And those listeners might ask, was the land price appreciation in the United States in the early 2000s that I've started my story with in some sense, that land price appreciation in the early 2000s, was it due to the Fed's low interest rate policy? If so, we might have to recast the Fed as being more akin to the unfortunate Uncle Billy than to George. But my answer to this query would be no. And the problem for this story is that land prices actually started to grow at a surprisingly fast rate when the Fed was following a relatively tight policy. So let me be concrete. From 1975 to 1996, land prices grew in real terms at less than 2% per year. In contrast, from 1996 to 2001, land prices grew by 11% per year in real terms. So we went from growing at less than 2 to growing at 11% per year. Now, in that 96 to 2001 period, the Fed was maintaining its target interest rate at between 4.75% and 6.5%. This is not generally considered to be loose monetary policy, especially given that the economy is actually entering a recession at the end of this period. Now, what it is true is the rate of growth of land prices accelerate even more, to 17% per year in the next 5 years. But I think the data clearly say that the fast rate of growth in U.S. land prices, what's sometimes called a bubble in land prices, originally started in 1996 without any obvious change in Fed policy. Now, I have to say this lack of an empirical connection is not surprising to me. At least at present, there is little or no economic theory to support a connection between monetary policy, as it's typically conducted in the United States, and the formation of bubbles. But if not the Fed, who or what was responsible for the high price of U.S. residential land? My views are more agnostic on this point, and I've heard several plausible stories. But in general, I think these stories tend to be overly focused on the United States in the 2000s. We saw large run-ups in land prices, followed by large falls in land prices in many other parts of the world in the 2000s. And these episodes have occurred repeatedly throughout history. We need to develop macroeconomic models and modes of thought that can somehow confront this broader scope of economic data. As opposed to just the United States in the 2000s, we have to think about internationally and over time. So let me wrap up. We have come through a very difficult recession, and it's caused in no little part by the large fall in land prices that took place after 2006. I believe that the size of the shock meant that this recession was going to be a painful and challenging one, regardless of the policy response. But it's also clear to me that the recession and the recovery would have been significantly worse in the absence of the actions of the Federal Reserve. Now, we have a couple of choices at this point. If you remember the end of It's a Wonderful Life, we can all end in a rousing chorus of Auld Lang Syne, or we can start taking questions. Now, every choice, as an economist I know, every choice faces with painful and daunting trade-offs. But anyone who knows my singing talents will tell you we've got to move to questions right now. Thank you very much.